It is Monday and of Thanksgiving week. If you're new here, I'm a therapist by day. I'm a therapist by night and day. But what I try to do here is just answer your questions to the best of my ability and hang out and make friends. Um, my specialty is growth, self growth, personal growth. I do a lot of personal growth coaching and couples counseling. In that personal growth coaching, I would tell you that a lot of those clients really start out with anxiety or mild depression or just kind of questioning the way that they parent or some changes that they're feeling in their relationship. And, and then I do a lot of couples counseling. Do I utilize the Gottman Institute? I am Gottman trained. I don't follow their protocol precisely, not because I think I know better, but because I haven't had their level 3 training and I haven't done the workshops and seminar. I mean, I've done workshops, but not their mentoring workshops. So, um, the Gottmans do 99% probably of the marriage and relationship research in the country, so you can't ignore that. And definitely, I definitely try to use that. I'm also very emotion focused in my couples counseling, so a lot of Susan David's joint work with the Gottmans is important in my practice. Tips on staying positive. Hello, hello. So many people pop on. Yay. Um, I staying positive is being able to, I think, and some people will say this borders on toxic positivity. Hello, realtor. I would say that if you can practice gratitude every single day, like with a vengeance, 3 things every day, focus on gratitude, it'll help you stay positive because really there's something to gain from everything, in my opinion. And I think that it's really beneficial if you can find those things and put your focus on them. And sometimes it's just a matter of shifting your focus and paying attention. I use the analogy a lot that if I lived with a dump outside my window, you always have the option of planting flower boxes. And when you look out the window, you don't have to look at the dump. You can look at the flower boxes. And so I think that's probably the best way to go about that. Hello, cool cat. How are you? Coworker plays pranks that are very upsetting, says it's just a joke, bad joke. Um, I would make sure, and it's perfectly okay to say I don't respond well to those kind of jokes. They don't feel funny to me. That's okay to say that. Is there a way to avoid codependency? Mm-hmm. Um, the short answer is yes. You avoid codependency, you heal codependency by working on self. You heal codependency by building esteem, by understanding that you're not responsible for the happiness of other people. You see, we become codependent when we believe that our only route to being loved is to please other people at our expense, regardless of what we want. That's the way that we develop codependency. We develop these maladaptive beliefs that my mom or my dad is only going to love me if I do better, if I act better, if I help, if I praise, if I sacrifice myself. And then we take that and we carry those beliefs on and we engage in relationships and we become afraid that we're not lovable or that they won't love us enough. And so we continue that behavior, that self-sacrificial behavior. I'll do it for you. I'll do it, even though you're perfectly capable of doing it for yourself. And for anybody who doesn't understand codependency, it goes above and beyond, like way outside of, I just feel like I want to help you with something, or I just feel like I want to be nice. Codependency is that thing that keeps us trapped in not looking at and taking care of our own needs. So when we step back and work on self-esteem and self-worth and self-value, lots of that is in part setting boundaries, right? Learning how to set boundaries and saying no, and saying, I don't have time because I have this other thing that's really important to me too. So I'm not going to engage. I'm not going to do that for you because it would mean sacrificing something that's super important for me too. So building your esteem, and by the way, if any of you really want to take a good hard look and kind of a DIY or a starting place for that, there's a book called Self-Esteem. It's by Kristin Neff. She also is a psychologist who works out of the University of Austin, out of the University of Texas at Austin. And if you just Google Kristin Neff, N-E-F-F, you'll probably find her website. And she has mindfulness meditations on there that help promote esteem. She has worksheets. I mean, there's all kinds of things people can do to help themselves without necessarily going to therapy, but I would definitely do that in conjunction with going to therapy. Your sister married a sociopath and he sadly ended her life. Oh my gosh. You think you develop it as a child. And her 4 children as well. Now dating for me is very hard and everyone seems like a narcissist to me. Well, princess, I can totally understand why dating would be hard for you. It'd be super hard to trust that somebody that you think was normal betrayed someone so violently. That's a trauma. And I would suspect that you probably could benefit from trauma therapy, maybe even EMDR. But it's specific, I would definitely, the thing about trauma is you don't have to be necessarily a direct recipient, although losing your sister and your 4 nieces and nephews is traumatic, of course. And so while it happened to them, it also happened to you. And that's a trauma. So I would say that in order for you to heal, you're definitely going to need to treat that like a significant event that shifted the way that you view life. Because how could it not? So yeah. And it's, if you were in an accident and practically severed your leg, you would go to the doctor so that he could fix it, and you'd probably need physical therapy so that you could walk again. And that's what trauma is like. We think, I actually did a seminar this morning about small t trauma, and we think that all these things, there's big problems in the world, but that in particular is a pretty damn big problem. And so don't minimize the impact it's had on your life. It's not a silly question by any stretch of the imagination. And I would tell you that it very much severed your perception of people. And that's a huge wound. And I think that it's going to take some work and some tender loving care to heal from that. So I hope that helps. Those people, we have empathetic tendencies that are hard to change. Yes. Let's talk about that, because narcissists are naturally attracted to people who are empathetic, right? And there's a difference, though, between being an empath, a healthy empath, and a healthy, compassionate person who experiences empathy easily, which isn't necessarily an empath, and then being codependent. Codependent isn't about the empathy. I want you to hear me for a minute, even though this might hit hard. Codependency is not about the empathy, the desire to be empathetic. Codependency is at its root about the fear of not being loved. And that's really important to understand, because from the fear of not being loved comes this unhealthy, what looks like an empathetic response. But a true empath has a different motivation for their behavior. Both of them have boundary challenges, but the codependent and the empath really have two different origins from where they operate that absence of boundaries. And I hope that makes sense. How do you get back to dating when you're afraid to open up out of fear and trauma? I think I answered that. Listen, you guys, none of this stuff really is a quick fix, right? The thing about who we are and the wounds that we carry, I would challenge you to, or I would at least challenge somebody to understand that it's a lifelong process. Nobody just kind of goes to therapy for a little while and fixes all the things. And believe it or not, I think I shared with the crew on Monday or Thursday last week that I was talking to my son about a month ago. I was traveling and I spent some time with him and his family. And I was talking about, so I don't know how much y'all know about me, but real quick, my first husband died. He was electrocuted from a power line. And it's a long story. You can go back in the very early parts of my TikTok and read all about that or listen to those stories. But ultimately, one of the things that happened that morning was he was walking across the street with his friend Jack, and Jack's wife said, "Hey, don't you guys read your power bill inserts? You're not supposed to play with power lines." And Rocky turned around, my husband, and said, "Oh, for crying out loud, stop worrying. It's going to be fine." And 10 days later, he was dead. And what's really important about that, and I didn't even know this, I didn't even notice it until I was talking with my son. For the rest of my life, so 35 years has gone by, every time somebody said to me, "Stop worrying, it'll be fine," I panicked. And it wasn't really literally until a couple of weeks ago that I understood why I panicked. My panic response when somebody tells me that is a trauma trigger. It's a traumatic response to something that's actually tied to this trauma that happened 35 years ago. Now, what's really interesting is 35 years ago, nobody was talking about trauma. PTSD for vets wasn't really even a thing. So I find it fascinating that I spent all this time and energy to become a therapist, going to therapists back in the day and then becoming a therapist. And I'm just now understanding how something like that has impacted the rest of my life. And why it's important is because I've had reactions to things that my children have done that they think are absurd. And I mentioned it to one of my daughters because we had a thing a few years ago where, she'd left her phone on airplane mode. I didn't see her location. I thought she'd gotten kidnapped by an Uber driver, and I freaked out, and she thought I was being ridiculous and blocked me. And it all sounds pretty dramatic, but the reality of it was my reaction was simply the panic because she had said, Mom, it's going to be fine. And I just think that's really interesting. It also makes perfect sense why I have another daughter who's getting ready to travel around the world. And, you know, my logic says, who does that in a global pandemic? But she's got a great head on her shoulders. She's thought of everything. But my trauma response panics in light of when she says, Mom, relax, it's going to be fine. My brain just has this highly myelinated neural pathway to an event that happened 35 years ago. And I want to just make sure that you understand that every behavior has a source. And it's so important to know that. You know, one of the videos I have pinned on my page is about developing self-awareness. And I think it's so vital because all of our behavior, I would reckon, is rooted in something in us. Because if we have no experience with it, then it's meaningless. Think about it. If we have no experience with it, it's meaningless. And if all of our experience is positive, then there's no negative connotation. There's no negative meaning. And it's just when you get that, it changes the way you understand who you are. You know, I tell people all the time that another one of my trauma responses is about abandonment. And when we understand our trauma responses, we can take responsibility and pull them apart. And we can be a little bit, and if we learn how to communicate about it, then we can take opportunities to be more vulnerable and say, hey, listen, you know, this is me. And I'm sorry that with all due respect to all of you, when I talk about it, I'm sorry that my crazy is impacting us. And I don't mean it disrespectfully. I'm using crazy as my chaotic thoughts that are up in my head, right? When all of that gets overwhelming, it comes out. And having some honesty and some vulnerability about it really makes a big difference in the communication. How do you deal? Hi, Christine. How do you deal with a spouse that was raised by a narcissist and has a lot of the behaviors? Boundaries. And I know that that's a cliche, but I will not allow myself to be treated this way. So, and you have to mean it. And that's the hard part about setting boundaries, right? Remember, the difference between an ultimatum says you do this or else. A boundary says, when this happens, this is what I'm going to do. A boundary talks about your behavior under a set of conditions. An ultimatum gives somebody a set of conditions for their behavior. That's why it doesn't work, because you're not in control of them. So a boundary is here. I hope that makes sense to you. Advice for a flirty sister and flirty husband. Oh, Jen. Boundary. Like, if they're flirty with each other, hard boundary. And I would say that sometimes what that means is you shut the door, really limit the relationship that you have with your sister. I mean, I don't know if you know my story, but my ex and my little sister are married today, and there was a lot of drama about that. So I might not even be able to answer that particular question without a ton of personal energy. Molly, you had an emotional outburst today and several times last week when you were setting boundaries. I think that you might want to sit back and think about, why do I have so much emotion over these boundaries? Because the thought that comes to my head is that you're scared that either A, your boundaries won't be honored, and then you're going to have to enact the consequences. Now, I could be totally wrong, but just kind of really sit with that emotion and try to figure out where the emotion is rooted. Boundaries are hard for that reason, because setting them without following through with consequences is meaningless. Almost Amish. If your partner is being abusive in therapy, you need to find a new therapist. Because a therapist who allows abuse to continue in this session, that's not cool. I had a viral video a month ago or so about a man who became abusive in session, and it needs to be shut down immediately. Amy, I want to talk about that, your point about when you grew up, nobody talked about trauma. If you guys think about it, psychology is a relatively new science, right? And when I say relatively new, modern psychology is really only about 40, 45 years old, maybe, because all of the people in the 60s and 70s were still coming out of behaviorism. And while there's value in understanding behaviorism, what we know today has so much more to do with emotions. And behaviorism is really more of like imprinting and positive and negative stimulus. Emotions really don't have anything to, I don't say that, but there's so much more. And unlike hard science, where you pour acid in a petri dish and something happens right away, or you can put it in a centrifuge and something happens right away, understanding consequences of certain things takes time. It takes time, right? Sorry, you guys have the hiccups. And so allowing for a longitudinal study requires time. And then there's this other little thing, like we can't intentionally cause trauma to people and then wait and document what happens. We can't do that. They used to, 100 years ago, 90 years ago, they used to do that, but we can't do that. So we have to wait for something traumatic to happen, or we have to ask people about traumatic events, and even that can border on inappropriate, because you don't want to have people reliving trauma. So, which by the way, they did a lot, and we know now that that's not cool. So, and we have fMRI imaging, which means that we can look at the brain and we can see the before and after effects of people who go through particular situations, right? I know there are people studying divorce, there are people studying children who go to foster care, and they're looking at before and after pictures of brains. And I think that's fascinating. So between the technology and the number of people who are studying and the time that has elapsed that's given credence to these outcomes, we know so much more. And in the seminar I gave this morning, it was to a group of retirees. It was in a retirement community. And I said, y'all come from, and maybe some of you come from this generation where you were supposed to suck it up and pull your big girl pants on. You're not the only person who has problems. And even today, some microculture families and communities still perpetrate or promote that mentality. And we know that that is wrong. It is unhealthy and it's wrong. This thing that's happening to you right now, if you perceive your life to be threatened, your emotional safety to be threatened, then that's considered a small t trauma. And that small t trauma by itself may not have a huge impact on you if you've got a really resilient persona. But if you're exhausted and you don't have a support system, and you have one small t on top of another small t on top of another small t trauma, now things are starting to happen up here. And our willingness to open up, our willingness to be vulnerable, our willingness to forgive, our willingness to do any of those things becomes compromised. One little thing by itself may not make a difference, but one right after the other does. And then we start forecasting, right? Then we start forecasting the idea that, well, this has always happened, so it's going to happen. It was really easy for me to say everybody who loves me dies or leaves me. And while that's partly what happened, a lot of that had nothing to do with me at all. But then our brains start going, well, it must be me. I mean, and society doesn't help. When I told my story last year, somebody on TikTok, I made a response on it, said, ooh, Black Widow. I mean, yeah, that's the kind of response that promotes additional kind of traumatic responses internally. So you're absolutely correct that, 20 years ago even, I was in grad school 20 years ago, 20 years ago. PTSD was tornadoes and war and car accidents and school shootings. Nobody was looking at the cumulative effects of small life-altering events. And the research that's coming out about that is phenomenal. And I can look at my life and I can look at the lives of my clients, my family members, and I can see it evidenced completely. So, yeah, people didn't talk about it, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist. Bluey, let me see what your question is. During separation, what would you look for to know it's safe to reunite? Well, that's a loaded question. It's a great question, but I would say that the couples that I've worked with that have separated and reunited found a way. Number one, they opened the avenues of communication, the channels of communication. Number two, they were both expressing vulnerability in that communication, and they re-established a friendship where they easily laughed, desire came naturally, and they had fun together. Those are the things, when you start feeling safe again with that partner, those are the reasons that you reunite. Yeah, that's the short answer. And a lot of that has, any more of my answer would be contingent on maybe some of the reasons that you broke up. Was there betrayal? Has trust been reestablished? Was there irresponsibility? Was there an addiction? I mean, there's just a lot of variables there. But I think ultimately it boils down to communication, vulnerability, and the ability to reestablish that friendship that anchors the relationship. I have anxiety and abandonment issues and codependent. I was abandoned as an infant. Yeah, Kathy, those are hard to come by. And there's, people will probably tell you there's attachment issues in that, abandonment fear. What I would tell you is to work on esteem and learn how to fill your bucket. And when I talk about that, what I mean is Learn how to, I have videos on this too. Learn how to validate yourself. Learn how to say, hey, I did a good job. Or I'm really proud of myself. Or I can do that. Or it's okay if I'm different. And I like that. I want that. I do that. Learn how to really stand strong. When you can do that, it becomes these people that love us and support us become not less important in terms of how much we want them in our life, but it's kind of like with that good solid foundation, if one of the support beams weakens, the whole foundation of the whole thing's not going to fall over. And that's what happens with abandonment, right? All of our ability to stand strong relies on these people to hold us there. And we get so afraid that any one of them leaving will allow us to teeter and maybe not be able to stand strong. And so by really paying attention to work on self-esteem, self-love, self-worth, it mitigates the effect of abandonment. No, it doesn't ever change it, but it mitigates it because you learn self-reliance. I hope that helps. How do you deal with a spouse that was raised by narcissists and has a lot of those behaviors? I think I answered that right, Christine. Boundaries. And I say boundaries, I'm also going to say self-worth, because a narcissist really only gets in when there's a crack in your sense of self, right? And we all have cracks. So it's about making sure that there's gates on those cracks, that you're aware of those cracks. Where are your vulnerabilities? And really paying attention to that, staying aware. Oh, Caitlin, I got a note back from the editor today and the manuscript. So this was a developmental edit. For all of you who are new here, I wrote a book about all that crap that I went through. And so I'm working with an editor now, and she made some suggestions of restructuring. And really it's going to take me a little bit of time, but I need to move some things around and maybe develop a couple of parts a little bit more fully. Overall, her words were, it's a compelling story that a lot of women will find of interest because it talks about how to persevere through some really significant life challenges. And she said that's a strength that everybody wants to know about, wants to learn about. So I'm hoping, I'm really hoping that I can dedicate some time. Whenever this happens, there's a give and take, right? Because there's only so many hours in a day. And so I just say, okay, universe, I need time to work on the book. And inevitably, I'll get a slew of cancellations in my schedule, which is the universe telling me giving me exactly what I asked for. But when those people cancel, then that's income that I don't get. So there's a fine balance, as I'm kind of telling the universe, a really fine balance between what I want it to do for me. So we'll see. Christmas is coming up, my surgery's coming up, and I think that'll give me some time to just hang out with my computer on my lap. So hopefully it'll be ready for a copy edit by the end of December. We'll keep our thumbs up. How do you heal from betrayal and wanting to move forward in a positive direction but struggle? Jen, the only thing that really heals betrayal is time. And I wish I had a better answer to give you. But betrayal betrayal is broken trust, right? And when there's broken trust, most of us get just a little bit afraid. It's like I don't know. Um I'll say it's like riding a bike. You ride a bike, you've been riding a bike for a while, then all of a sudden you have this really bad accident. And you start thinking, gosh, maybe I don't want to get back on that bike. And so I think that it's really important for us to love ourselves, give ourselves grace, give ourselves some time. I always, when I'm working with couples and there's betrayal, I always require the person, the perpetrator of the betrayal, I require complete and total transparency. Because without that, it's almost impossible to prevent the fear from taking over. Now, having said that, we live in a time when people can fake almost anything, right? I mean, you can say, here's the password to my phone, but you have a burner phone tucked away someplace. You can say, sure, you can open my email, but on your work laptop, you have 5 other emails. I mean, if somebody wants to sneak around, they're going to sneak around. And they're going to do it probably well. The people who get caught, honestly, my theory is they're tired of keeping up the facade, and so they want to be caught. And they get sloppy and lazy, but with their secret keeping. That's just a theory. So time is the only thing that heals a betrayal. And I often will tell people it's like having open heart surgery. The skin may heal closed shortly afterwards because they glue it and all that kind of stuff. The skin is closed. But all those muscles that they had to cut through, those are sore for months. And the scar that's there, that doesn't even start to fade for more than a year at best. So when there's a betrayal, whether it's infidelity or some other familial betrayal or friendship, that's like open heart. It's an open heart wound. And it will heal as slowly as a physical open heart wound. So I think that that's important to understand. Why does everybody speak about narcissism over the past couple of years? Ramtam, I think that's a good question. No problem, Jen. First of all, I think that our political environment had raging examples of narcissism. And so it was kind of in our face. Yes, we were forced to witness narcissism firsthand. Now, having said that, I also think there's just been, probably 2016. Oh, wait a minute. When did he get elected? 20. He got elected in 16. So 2014, right? 2014, when, thank you, Caitlin, for looking. When like the presidential whispering started, that's when people started pointing out that Trump was a narcissist. I'm not being political, just factual. And so I think it had everybody kind of talking about narcissism. And then, of course, the more articles that were published, the more people got on the bandwagon. And the more crazy it got, the bigger that bandwagon got. And I really think that's why narcissism became so highlighted in public view, because there was such a blatant example. And then everybody, all the news outlets, all the magazines, all the big content creators were talking about it, podcasts, books, you name it. And then people started identifying the characteristics, going, oh shit, I know somebody like that. And Ramtam, I'm going to agree with you in so much as I believe that many people who demonstrate narcissistic tendencies don't necessarily fall into the DSM classification for narcissistic personality disorder. I think that they're definitely two separate things. Many people will demonstrate a couple of or one narcissistic tendency. And there's so many different kinds of narcissism, right? But that overt kind, the narcissistic personality disorder that we classify as kind of mainstream narcissism, it's the most destructive, although I might argue that covert narcissism could be more devastating emotionally to the narcissist, to their victim. But I really think that is probably why awareness got raised so significantly. Was often shut down, Amy, emotionally growing up. Yes, I mean that's the consequence of people not having emotions validated. They shut down. They stop talking. They invalidate themselves because they were invalidated throughout their life. That's the consequences of suck it up, put your big girl pants on, I'll give you something to cry about. All of those sentences, which people my age heard constantly, are invalidating of emotions. People who say, that's nothing to cry over, that invalidates my feelings. And so hundreds of thousands, millions of people learned that their feelings, learned not to listen to their feelings. They learned that the only acceptable feeling was happy, sad, mad. And they don't know how to talk about emotions. I mean, I see people like that weekly in my office. What do you mean you don't know if you're disappointed? I said, gosh, that must be disappointing. Well, not really. I was just angry. You weren't disappointed? Well, I don't know. They don't even know how to name something as simple as disappointed because they never had the opportunity to really learn what disappointment felt like. Let's see. Is empathy and sympathy a learned emotion? I know someone who has never shown much love when growing. It certainly can be. I think some people are naturally empathetic. An empath, I think, is naturally empathetic. I do think some people need to be taught. And some personality types and some personality disorders naturally are void of empathy. I think it's a really interesting question, but my sense is that it's both. Some amount of empathy for most of us is natural. One of the ways we diagnose sociopathology or sociopaths is this complete absence of empathy. Also with narcissism, but I think you can also deepen empathy and learn empathy depending on the family that you're in. Something as simple as teaching kids about their own feelings and then trying to get them to relate that to other people in similar experiences. And I think a lot of us naturally do that. I think you need to share your toy with Johnny because Johnny doesn't have that. Or the other thing that's coming to mind is that my parents always told us that before Santa could come, we had to clean out our toy chest, because he would recycle those toys and give them to children in Africa. Poor kids in Africa, they were constantly, in my mind, getting our hand-me-downs, our clothes, our food, our toys. But we were taught very early to think about other people who had less than we did. And I think that's empathetic. Just learning to express feelings at 54. Good for you, Candy. Seriously, it is never, ever too late. Don't, all my boomer and Jones's generation and Gen X friends and clients, it is never too late to learn how to communicate, to learn how to talk about your feelings and communicate them with other people. What are the key words to look for when someone is expressing their emotions that they are not sincere? Hello, Brooks. How are you? That's a good question. What comes to my mind right away is to pay attention to words and body to see if they match. Right? If somebody says, "Yeah, I'm sorry," the words and the body and the tone, they don't match. So we know that that's passive aggressive, right? It's kind of a classic definition of passive aggressive, when you say one thing but you mean another. So I think that has something to do with sincerity. If my tone, my eyes, my body don't match, then it's likely not sincere. I also would say if there's an overreaction with the words, it might not be sincere. Those are the two things that come off to the top of my head. Technology has allowed cycle breakers to be validated and have resources for learning healthy parenting. Yes, Rust, you are 100% correct about that. And I love that. Not only that, but I also think that going to therapy is way more validated and accessible than it ever was. People don't feel shame having a therapist these days, at least most people. And I think that there's a lot more self-help books that are being written. I mean, I just think there's not just technology, but the access to healthy behaviors and the openness about mental health has created a lot of opportunity for people to realize that there's a different way and so that they can break those generational patterns. Even at age 47, you're quick to hide tears from others. Yeah, I'm glad that you're in here a lot, because I hope that by being a part of my lives and a part of other therapists' lives, that you can start to get a sense that normal is, that a healthy way of being is learning how to feel. It's not just learning, but it's doing the feeling, and it's something that you just have to slowly but surely let yourself do. And yeah. What is projection? Drum drops. I think because that's twisting my tongue, I really think I need to just say drum. I hope you don't mind. Um, Projection is when I pretty much puke on you the things that are happening inside of me. So I may blame you for something that I'm thinking or feeling. A classic projection is I'm afraid of being left, and so I blame you for abandoning me. Or I'm really not confident, and so I say, you probably don't even like me. So that's my insecurity getting projected onto you. Hope that makes sense. If I cry, my husband never asks why and doesn't even say what's wrong. He completely ignores it. Mama Shellis. So here's the other side of emotions, right? The other side of that is people who don't have any comfort level with emotions for themselves are super uncomfortable when other people have emotions. And so he may be, and I say may because I have to believe that you wouldn't still be with him if he was a complete jerk. So my hypothesis then is that he may be so totally thrown off. Like, I don't know why she's crying. I don't know how to help her. I'm just going to avoid his discomfort. He's going to avoid his discomfort. If he asked you what's wrong, he has to acknowledge that you're crying, and he's going to be uncomfortable with that. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not validating or suggesting that how he's handling this is positive, but that's probably, or a very good one of the reasons that he could be acting that way. His own discomfort with emotion, it's so uncomfortable that he doesn't even want to face that, so he's just going to avoid the fact that there's emotion altogether. Baking, people tend to finish your sentences, interrupt you, and it's frustrating. You're right. That sucks. That really sucks. And you're in control of that to some extent, right? It's really important when somebody interrupts you. Excuse me. I was speaking. May I finish? Hold on. I'm not finished. I'd like to finish my point. That was my story to tell, or whatever it is, but you need to call out the person who's not giving you space to share. You need to call that behavior to their attention and take back your space. That's really important, because over time, that dismissal of your space, it just comes in and comes in and comes in and comes in, and pretty soon you'll be claustrophobic because you won't have any space that you maintain to control. It's a little bit like having squatters, right? And they say, hey, the landowner hasn't said anything. You guys can come in. You can be here too. And then before you know it, you're overrun with people who think that you don't care, that they talk all over you. Show them you care by setting a boundary, standing up for yourself. How can you work through, hello, Stacy. How can you work through feelings of guilt over your failed marriage? So, guilt often stems from shoulda, woulda, coulda. But here's the thing, and I'm just going to be super direct. Every time, I'll say it this way. Every time I say shoulda, woulda, coulda, the next thing out of my mouth is, yeah, well, you didn't. And you didn't because in that moment in time, and I promise you, I've done this exercise. I have gone back to every single time that I thought shoulda, woulda, coulda, and I have said, given the exact, and I mean the identical circumstances, not this advanced knowledge, but everything that existed in that point in time, given that, what would I do? And almost always, I would have made the same choice because I didn't have this reflective information back then. And I'm not in the habit of making asinine choices, nor are most of us, by the way. Most of us, especially when it comes to marriage or those big parts of our lives, we make the best decision that we know how to make in that given point in time. And so it's really important to do that just to prove to yourself that, yeah, it's not like I consciously screwed this up. It's not like even for those things that you think, God, I knew better. I knew better. But I should have made the other choice. But you didn't. And you didn't make the other choice because in that moment, even though there was something pulling you in this direction, the choice you made, for some reason, made more sense. And I honestly made more sense or satisfied a more immediate need. Right? There's not a thing in my life that hasn't held true for. You know, I got a ridiculous speeding ticket one time. Like, I knew the cop was there. I knew he was there. But I also knew that I needed to get where I was going. And there was a microsecond where that need overrode my knowledge. And that kind of thing happened. You know, whether or not you have an extra drink and then you spend all night throwing up, or you marry the wrong person. I mean, oh my God. You know, if you know my story, you know I married the wrong person. And when the first person that ever read my manuscript said, oh my God, like halfway through this book, I don't know who I hated more, you or your ex-husband. I'm like, why would you hate me? She goes, because you didn't get out of there. And I'm like, I didn't think about it like that. But you know, in my mind, it wasn't that obvious. In my mind, hope was a good thing. In my mind, being willing to forgive was a good thing. In my mind, all these things. And so, you know, you do the best you can. So that's what I would say to you. And I know that that's a pretty long way of explaining it. But guilt, there's no value in that. Guilt is just about shoulda, woulda, coulda. And there's no value in that because you didn't. You can't go back and change it. The other thing I would tell you is that I truly believe that relationship and all, you know, this is true for everybody, I believe, was important in your life. And so sit back and try to understand or try to look for the things that made it important. And then focus on that. It's really easy to focus on how foolish I was. But every single time I think about I shoulda, woulda, coulda, I'm like, but I have these 3 amazing daughters. So I needed that relationship to have these children. And I can't imagine my life without them. So it was perfect. And, you know, ultimately I live by the creed that this moment in time is perfect in its overall intention for my life. Even the moments that are awful, I've learned how to trust that this moment in time is perfect for its intention in my life. And I understand that I'm saying that about some really tragic things. And I understand that many people say that's absurd, that's toxic positivity, that things don't necessarily happen for a reason, or something good doesn't come out of everything bad. But I don't personally find that true. And I'm a person who's been widowed twice and divorced a serial cheater, blah, 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 blah. And if I can say that under those circumstances, after having spent 2 decades evaluating myself and my life, it's true for me. So hopefully that that answers what you needed it to answer. Rusty, you used to interrupt people a lot in your healing. You learned that since you never felt heard. That's actually a good point. You never got heard as a child. You wanted to interrupt your voice. That's actually a really good point. Michelle, you married the wrong person as well, and you're still in it. It's really hard. It really is so hard. Some women don't have the funds to leave. You're right. La Dulce, there's so many people. You're right, you guys. And the one thing I think about as I was writing my manuscript, I thought I had privilege, and I had the ability to leave without severely disrupting my life. And I recognize that privilege. But I will also tell you, and I think this is true, that I would have left even if it meant I had to live in a cardboard house or a cardboard hut. Because when I finally got to the point where I had to leave, I was willing to suffer any consequence. And it's awful that it has to get to that point, but that's why we have homeless shelters, as horrible as that sounds. And here again, so, okay, let's talk about that for a second, because the first time I found out he was cheating, I wanted to leave, but I had a 2-week-old baby, and I had 3 other children. So I had 4 total children, no degree, and a 2-week-old baby. Where was I going? And the truth is, I made a conscious choice to stay in that marriage rather than be homeless. That was my conscious choice. And sometimes, I made a video the other day, and I talked about this hard truth that sometimes we lie to ourselves. And I think it's really easy to look back and say, I was stuck. But I wasn't stuck. I could have left. And I could have taken my kids and gone to a homeless shelter. I probably was in the throes of narcissistic abuse. There were people at our church I could have moved in with. I could have moved home. But the pain of doing all that, this is not a flattering way to say this, but ultimately I sold myself out. And I stayed in a marriage that I was abused in, not emotionally abused in, because I didn't have, I'll say I didn't have the courage to be homeless. And I think that that's the truth. And in that moment, the pain of staying did not outweigh the pain of leaving. So when it does, you leave. When the pain of staying outweighs the pain of leaving, or the other way around, you leave. Even though you don't have any of those things. And I know that that's hard to hear. But that was what was true for me. And, I know everybody's situation is a little bit different, and it's not there's no easy answer. But I see that a lot. I'm obligated to care for my elderly mom, even though she was doing. Thank you guys for sharing the live and all of that. Drum. The truth is, and I know this, I'm feeling really bold tonight with all of these hard truths, but you're not obligated. Nobody is obligated to care for an abuser. And I appreciate that you have so much love in your heart. You're willing to sacrifice yourself for that, but no one is obligated. Now, you might feel obligated, but feelings don't represent the truth all of the time. Feeling obligated and being obligated are two different things. And that's important to understand. Nobody has to care for an abuser. There's so many psychological components to that. You know, the way that we want to see ourselves, the way we want other people to see ourselves. Maybe there's some kind of religious or spiritual piece there that says this is what good people do. But I want you to be really truthful with yourself. And this is kind of what I meant when I made that video the other day. Sometimes we convince ourselves of things, about things that aren't actually truthful. And it's not like we're intentionally being dishonest, but we're telling ourselves something because it helps us make sense over our actions, but we're actually not telling ourselves the truth. And you guys, this is the kind of self-awareness that I preach. And it's hard sometimes because we have to see ourselves in ways that are uncomfortable. But if you're not standing in what's real, happiness isn't possible. It's not. In order to find happiness, you must stand in what's real for you. The truth part. Not the part you've convinced yourself is real. Not the facade. But the truth piece. And if it was easy, we would all be happy. What if mom changed over the years? Doesn't that change my answer? If it was, yes, if there was true change, remorse, and a reckoning, right? A combined reckoning. I absolutely think that you can forgive people who make an effort to see themselves and to change hurtful behavior. In which case, it still doesn't change the obligation piece. Nobody's obligated. I don't think. And I certainly don't think it's fair to hold our children accountable for caring for us. I think it's nice. I do think it's nice. I spoke to a woman today who refuses to put her mother into a nursing home. Okay. But I pray to God that my children don't feel like that's their only option. Because, I just figured I had enough kids, they could take turns coming to see me. Everybody could pick a day. And between my kids and my grandkids, I've got at least, they only have an obligation to be there once a week. What do you do when family won't help you and you have no one? You build a support system. And I know that that is super easy for me to say and very hard to do, and it takes time, but you build a support system. A family, the best family is a family of choice. Whether it's you join a church or a club, or you volunteer someplace and you say, I'll take care of your kids, we'll switch off days, or I'll ride with you and we can run errands, or you have to ask though, and you have to be proactive in that effort. And it can be uncomfortable especially if you're an introvert, but without a support system, you are alone. And it's not anybody's responsibility to be there for us. And so we have to build that network. And we don't really have a choice. You have to, I personally think it's an adulting task that we don't teach very well. Candle, I'm not sure if you're still here, but can I define what emotional abuse is? Emotional abuse, I have a video about this. I have content if you scroll back. But emotional abuse is anything that diminishes your sense of self. So it's belittling, it's criticizing, it's name calling, it's withholding affection, it's so like the silent treatment. Anything that diminishes or dismisses you is considered emotional abuse today. I hope you're still here. Would neglect and ignoring be emotional abuse? Yes. It's so easy to be sorry or to say, gosh, I wish that hadn't happened. But I guarantee you, I would not be sitting in this chair doing this today if I was married to that man. It wouldn't have happened. And so when I sit back and I think about all of the people that I help, I'm so grateful for the life, for coming to this point. You know, I really believe that what I do today has meaning and value, and I'm just so grateful for that opportunity. So I can guarantee you, though, I would not be sitting in this chair. I mean, I didn't even become a therapist until after I divorced him. So, yeah. And God, I don't even know if I would be here if Harlan was still alive. You know, TikTok didn't exist when so for those of you who don't know me, after my divorce, I did eventually meet somebody, and we had 10 amazing years together, and then he got sick and passed away a couple of years ago. And so, you know, it all leads you. And I think ultimately that's what my editor asked me to kind of summarize what my book was about. And I think I would say that my book ends up being about all of pain, all of life's pain leads you to where you need to be. And you may not like it, but I believe it leads you there. So, yeah, at least that's how I make sense out of it. And I want to encourage you to find a way to kind of conceptualize it. That, oh my gosh, what is that? Thank you. Whatever, that's funny, I haven't seen that before. Whatever it is that is happening in your life right now, I promise you, you cannot conceptualize 5 years from now. You just can't. There's nothing in my existence would have allowed me to conceptualize this. So trust, learn how to trust that whatever's happening is taking you on a journey, and it's leading you where in a place that you might need to go. That's what my story is. And I think it can be everybody's if they open the door to that possibility. Good night, everybody, and happy Thanksgiving.